Did Jesus already return? Has the millennial reign of Christ been hidden from us? Are we living in Satan's little season?
In our last video, we already introduced the little season of Satan, that Jesus came back in 70 AD at the destruction of the temple and then reigned on this earth for 1,000 years.
Today, we're going to examine some of the historical claims used to support this eschatology, and we're going to dig into their context a little bit more. Are they saying what they say they're saying?
So if you're a part of this movement, or maybe you have a family member who is, or you're just curious about how to understand some of these historical facts better, we hope that you'll stick all the way through to the end.
Let's jump in.
So there's Josephus.
Flavius Josephus.
Nero being the beast or the Antichrist.
The statue that Nero built.
The Geneva Bible.
1560 Geneva Bible.
We're going through Josephus, Nero, and the Geneva Bible. We're looking at the historical evidence and does it line up with reality, the little season narrative. And if you're interested in getting into the details and seeing the research, we have a downloadable handout in the video description below. And we also have another video that you can watch where we read through that handout.
The first one we're going to talk about is Josephus, and the claim goes something like this. In the Bible, it says when Jesus returns, there's going to be all this cosmic stuff that happens, and Josephus, when he writes about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, records cosmic stuff happening. So was that Jesus' return?
Roman historian Flavius Josephus, because he documented some very miraculous events in between 70 and 76 AD when I believe the second coming of Christ happened.
The little season community, especially those that are leading the conversation, frequently point to Josephus, the first century historian who is Jewish, who recorded these cosmic signs and wonders. And doesn't this tell us that Jesus returned? That's great that they're going back to these ancient sources. But the problem is when we actually pay attention to what Josephus says, not just in one or two lines, but in his entire narrative and all of his writings, it does not line up with this whole little season eschatology theory that Jesus came back in 70 AD.
So the first question we want to address is, did Josephus actually write this stuff down? And the answer is yes, he really did record cosmic signs happening during the destruction of the temple. He talks about a sword in the sky. He talks about a comet. He talks about chariots in the clouds and a light coming out of the temple. And so, yeah, we feel pretty comfortable saying, sure, Josephus potentially did witness some pretty crazy cosmic events, and he wrote them down. So for starters, the Bible's pretty clear that when Jesus returns, everyone will see Jesus. And Josephus records these cosmic signs, but he doesn't record anything like Jesus actually being visible, coming on the clouds, anything like that. And so if we remember the claim, when Christ returns, there will be cosmic signs. Josephus records cosmic signs. So does that mean that that is when Jesus returns?
So it seems like for this to work for the little season community, three things have to be true.
Yeah, so Josephus has to be a reliable recorder of these events. He has to be textually trustworthy and not something that other people went back and messed with. And also, since he lived into the time of the millennial reign of Christ, according to their timeline, you would think that he would write about it at some other point in his writings. But when we examine these claims, we find out they kind of fall apart.
We believe Josephus is a legitimate historian. It's just, can you use him to thus say, Jesus returned?
One point is that we know that Josephus was a good historian, but he doesn't always have everything perfectly accurately. How do I know to say that? Well, because he actually records some of the things that the Bible also talks about. And we believe the Bible's true. We believe that the Bible recorded history accurately. And when Josephus talks about John the Baptist, he tells a little bit of a different story than when the Bible talks about John the Baptist. And when Josephus talks about Herod Agrippa and his death, he tells a little different story than the Bible talks about Herod Agrippa and his death. And so if I'm going to choose between the Bible or Josephus, I'm going to say, well, the Bible is the one that's accurate, but then that should give us pause as we're using Josephus to give legitimacy to these historical things.
If you want exact references, download our resource. Something we've noticed about the little season eschatology community is that they're quick to dismiss anyone and any historian that does not line up with their narrative. Like if it doesn't line up with what you think is reality, it must be a deception of Satan. And so you have an incredibly high bar that these other sources have to pass, but then you're not applying that same standard to Josephus. Josephus displays unreliability in comparison to Scripture. but we look the other way because it backs up the narrative that we want to believe. And I think that's risky.
Mm-hmm. Another part of Little Season eschatology is to claim that, well, we can't trust historians because they've been tampered with somehow. But what's so interesting is actually Josephus is one of those historians that pretty much everyone agrees has been tampered with. Like, that's not a conspiracy theory. People will say, no, Josephus was edited by later people who were transcribing his writings, because Josephus actually talks about Jesus. And so there's this section of Josephus where he talks about Jesus, and he calls him the Christ and said he rose again from the dead. We know Josephus was not a Christian author. He was a Jewish author. Nowhere else in his writing does he make any mention of Jesus being the Jewish Messiah, even though he writes at length about the Jewish faith. And so pretty much everybody agrees what happened here is that some later Christian author, trying to make the Bible seem more plausible, went back and edited this part of Josephus to make it sound like Josephus was corroborating the New Testament. So again, if you're somebody who's following Little Season eschatology and you're quick to dismiss history as being edited, well, actually, we know that Josephus was edited. And so shouldn't that make us, again, just take a pause as we use him as a reliable source?
Yeah, and he argued for Judaism throughout his writings. And that would be very confusing for him to be both promoting the Jewish faith and that Jesus is the Christ. Mm-hmm. It doesn't line up.
Well, and it gets to the third problem with him, too, is that Josephus wrote about the Jewish wars in 75 AD, but that wasn't his last book. He kept writing. And so he has a work called Antiquities of the Jews. He has another work called Against Apion. And both of these are dated to the time of the millennial reign of Christ, according to Little Season eschatology. But Josephus doesn't recognize that Jesus has taken the messianic throne. And in fact, he's actually arguing for the validity of Judaism against other ways of operating in the world. And so why would Josephus be doing that if he was living under the reign of Christ? Why would he continue to be advocating for his version of Judaism? It just doesn't make sense. So just to summarize, Josephus did record cosmic events, but he is unreliable when it comes to scripture. He doesn't tell history the same way the Bible does. He's unreliable as far as just his trustworthiness, because we actually know he was edited, and he continued to live into what should have been the millennial reign of Christ, and yet doesn't make any mention of it in his extensive writings.
Doesn't seem like Josephus is the foundation that you should build an entire theological system on.
Which brings us to our next claim.
We're talking about Nero.
The statue that Nero built, and that you had to worship his statue before you could enter this marketplace. Again, it's like you had to worship the beast, the beast system, to buy or sell. So
this second claim is also really popular. It has to do with the mark of the beast and the Emperor Nero. And the claim goes something like this. Nero is who John was talking about in the book of Revelation, because according to this way of numbering Hebrew letters called gematria, 666 can be Nero Caesar.
Nero set up a giant, colossal statue of himself. And this would have had to take place before the destruction of the temple, right, if he's the beast. So before 70 AD. And during this season, Christians were required to participate in idolatrous worship of the statue in order to buy and sell and engage in economic activity. Mm-hmm. That's the claim.
Yeah, which would be a really strong historic claim for Nero being the beast, if it were true.
Yeah, we're coming at it from an amillennial perspective, which would say it's not that Nero isn't a beast, a type of Antichrist that we see come in and out of history all the time as people give themselves to following the evil one and turn away from Christ. It's just that like dispensationalism and Little Season eschatology require like exactness and literal figures to fulfill these pictures in Revelation, and Little Season eschatology has chosen Nero to exactly fulfill the beast theology, and we just don't think he lines up perfectly.
Yeah, I think it's likely that John had Nero in mind. Whether John was writing before 70 AD or after 70 AD, I think he was intentionally using language to make us think of Nero, but not because Nero was the ultimate fulfillment of that prophecy, but because Nero was a really good example of what that kind of prophecy looked like, and to be on guard that that might happen again. And that's actually what we see, is that there is this widespread empire requirement to offer idol worship in order to engage in buying and selling. It just doesn't happen under Nero. It happens under Emperor Decius. And so Decius was an emperor in 250 AD, and we have historical evidence that he required idol worship, and he required a certificate to prove that you worshipped the idol. And this certificate was called a libellus. And so that did happen. Like, that's legit. That occurred. It just didn't occur under Nero. It occurred 200 years after Nero.
Yeah, it's something that grabs our imagination. I remember reading, like, in the Left Behind series, where it talks about, you know, this sort of economic system, buying and selling, and you had to have the mark of the beast, right? Like, it grabs our attention. And just because it's a good story doesn't mean it's true, though, right? Like, a different Roman emperor did it, not Nero. And so for us to put that weight on Nero, again, we're seeing a foundation that is crumbling under the weight that it's being asked to support.
And we just want to address, we're aware of the phantom time theory, part of this eschatology. And so, well, maybe it was something that happened under a different emperor, but actually that emperor really lived under the 1st century. However, when this claim is being made, it's usually not presented that way. It's usually presented as, this is something Christians just didn't know, that Nero did this thing. And once you know that he did the thing, all the pieces fall together. And Nero just can't support that weight.
If we're coming across as a little strong here and that we're pushing back, it's because, man, if you're going to like have such a radically like transformative worldview, then it needs to be based on good sources. And if it's really based on the shaky foundation, then it's just like chaos. You're creating chaos by doing all these things with the reasons that aren't really good.
Yeah, we hear this idea of, well, go do your own research. And so we want you to do that. This is hopefully just an encouragement in that same way of thinking, like, yeah, let's do some research. And that brings us to our third claim.
The Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is something that the Little Season community references all the time, and we really want to take the time to address it. We've actually had people in our comments raise the Geneva Bible and Josephus, not yet Nero. You could be the first person to reference Nero, but we really want to address the Geneva Bible.
This first claim is that the Geneva Bible was written during the millennial reign of Christ. And so the idea is, even though the Geneva Bible says 1560 or a later edition 1599, actually that 1 at the beginning of the date should better be read as an I for Jesus or Jesus. And so this claim is being made that the Bible wasn't actually written in the 1500s, it was written in the millennial reign, potentially in the 500s. And then on top of that, there's also often this claim that maybe English was the millennial language, and so these early English editions of the Bible, the Tyndale, the Geneva Bible, are somehow KJV, they're somehow more reliable, better versions of the Bible than our modern translations, because our modern translations are trying to go back to the original languages and they've been corrupted somehow along the way. So the Geneva Bible is seen as this much more reliable version of the Bible because it's older and potentially from the millennium.
The Geneva Bible. This is a 1599 version of the New Testament cover of the Geneva Bible, printed in London. And you can see here, that is not a 1. That is an I for Jesus. That is 599 years after Jesus.
Yeah, if Jesus oversaw the publication of a Bible, you'd probably want to pick up that Bible. I follow that, but I disagree that Jesus physically reigned on earth for 1,000 years.
Another way that the Geneva Bible is used is in its notes in the margins. And so it's not even necessarily the text of the Bible itself, but it's the marginal notes that seem to give credence to some of these claims of Little Season eschatology. And so in the 1599 edition, there's actually an introductory page to the book of Revelation that's called The Order of Time. And it has a timeline where it seems to suggest that, like, the destruction of the temple was significant. Satan was bound 1,000 years later. Satan was loosed. And so when you see that for the first time, I mean, that does feel like very weighty evidence.
The Geneva Bible is like a study Bible for the Reformation.
But if you're claiming it was written in the millennium, it's a study Bible for the millennial reign. And that's where we get into some problems.
It seems like the Little Season community is using the Geneva Bible in two different ways. First, it's saying it was written during the millennial reign of Christ, and it contains prophecy about the time period following the millennial reign of Christ.
Right, but written in the past tense, as if these were things that already had happened. So let's take a pause and give some historical context to the Geneva Bible the way most scholars would acknowledge it today. They would say the Geneva Bible was written by the Reformers, think John Calvin, and they read the book of Revelation coming from a historicist perspective. And so they didn't see all of the events of Revelation as happening in the first century, like a preterist would. They don't see the whole book of Revelation as happening sometime in the distant future, like a futurist would. They didn't read it really the way that I would primarily read it, which is to say these are things that are happening as part of humanity, kind of the spiritual symbolic description. They said, no, the book of Revelation is kind of like a timeline. It's describing historic events, and we should be able to map them against events in history. And so the Reformers were in the 1500s, and so they went back and they saw these different pieces of Revelation, and they said, that verse corresponds to this historical event, and that verse corresponds to this historical event. But they saw those historical events as happening between 0 and 1500, because that's when they were living. And so that's how you make sense of these notes in the margins of the Geneva Bible, but that's not the way Little C's and Eschatology reads their notes.
It seems like the Reformers kind of read their Bibles the way dispensationalists read their Bibles in this particular one, right? Dispensationalists would say these events have to unfold in a historical way, but in the future. And the Reformers said, it did happen in this way, just in the past. And I guess Little C's and Eschatology would fall more into that past camp as well. We actually show both timelines in our Amillennial and Little C's and Eschatology in our first video.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to note that throughout history, humans have felt like they were at the culmination of time, right? There is this sense that we always feel like it's us. We're the generation where this is going to happen and this is going to take place, whether it's the return of Christ or the battle of Gog-Magog or whatever the case is. Like we want to see ourselves as kind of the key piece to the story, and the Reformers were no different. So that's what they were doing in the marginal notes according to modern scholarship. But let's see how the Little C's and Eschatology uses those notes and how it contradicts their own ideas. One of the pieces of history that comes up in the Geneva Bible over and over again is a reference to a pope, Pope Boniface VIII, who, according to the notes in the margins, lived during 1295 AD. And the Reformers, the authors of the marginal notes, make this claim that he is fulfilling a lot of these different prophecies in Revelation. Now, again, coming from modern scholarship, that makes sense. They didn't like this pope. They thought that he was the culmination of the 1260 days. That's fine. But for Little C's and Eschatology holders to say that this Bible was written during the millennium, but then the notes are talking about something that happened in 1295, it doesn't add up. And it's actually because of the phantom time that they sometimes use to explain these other events. And so, according to the theory, there are about 700 years that we think happened, according to our history books, but didn't actually happen. They've been added in. And those events that we think might have happened during that time, they would say, well, some of them actually happened during the first century, cataclysmic volcano or other cosmic sign type stuff. Or they would say positive things like classical music, beautiful architecture. That actually was during the millennium, before 1076 AD. And then other things they would say, like maybe the Crusades, well, maybe that happened when Satan was released, right after 1076 AD. But they don't really have a space for the Middle Ages. They don't believe the Dark Ages occurred. They don't think a lot of medieval history is real. And that's where we have a problem, because this Pope Boniface VIII, lived during the Middle Ages, and in the Bible, it talks about him living during the Middle Ages. And so there's kind of two options here, and I'm going to do them quickly, but if you want to get more into the weeds, go check out our other video and the downloadable resource. So either the people who were writing the Millennium Bible, the Geneva Bible, were saints during the millennial reign, and they were talking about something happening in their understanding 1295 AD, aka 1295 years after Christ. But if that's true, then it actually happened in our time, 1995. And I don't know about you, but I was alive in 1995, and I don't remember Pope Boniface VIII. So that would be a really big deception for that to have happened during my lifetime. The other option is that the saints who were writing the Millennial Bible, Geneva Bible notes, were referencing 1295, not in their time, but according to our counting of time. But our accounting of time is the Satan deception accounting of time. So they would be writing their marginal notes during the millennium using Satan's fake chronology in order to deceive us. You can't have it both ways.
Right. So what you're saying is, because of like little season eschatology keeps promoting this idea of phantom time. There's maybe 700 years. And I get not everyone agrees. I'm sure not everyone agrees about all these things. But what you're saying is, because of the 700 years of phantom time theory, like, then they're making this prediction in 1985. Like, that's how the math works out. And if you're really holding to this, they were writing during the millennium reign. They were writing about the future. 1995. We were around during 1995. Didn't happen. Or it's during the millennial reign, but they're actually, like, the Geneva Bible now is an agent of deception.
Right.
Right? That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is kind of what gets me so animated about it, is that this Geneva Bible, which is being used by little season eschatology holders, was actually written by the reformers, who largely held an amillennial perspective of the end times. And so their way of understanding what was going to happen would not line up with little season eschatology from what we know about the reformers. And actually the Reformation is something I've heard little season eschatology thinkers, creators get questioned about it, and they go, yeah, we don't really know what to do with it. And I think this is why, because it just doesn't fit. And yet this is such a core and important part of our faith history. And so that's, again, just an encouragement to be consistent and do some research, because God's truth matters, and we hold that really valuably, and we want to encourage everybody to do that too.
Yeah, the scripture says Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that his revelation is true. And I know that you say you would believe that, but it does seem like then you're creating a narrative about that requires so much distortion of reality.
Yeah. And we're not claiming that this is some sort of like slam dunk debunking, dismantling this theory, because I'm sure that apart from these three historical points, you could still continue the narrative of little season eschatology, and no doubt people will continue to do so. But we'd like to encourage you that as you're listening to people and making your own conclusions, when you hear Josephus or Nero or the Geneva Bible mentioned, just see how they're mentioning it and see if they're really giving you the whole picture.
So let's summarize. First, we have Josephus, who theoretically recorded Jesus coming back in 70 AD, but then his actual narrative doesn't line up with Scripture. We know that his writings have been edited by later scribes or people with an agenda, and he doesn't seem to write about Jesus, the return of Christ, at any other point in his life. How about Nero?
Yeah, so then we have Nero, which, again, common claim that he probably is related to the 666 and that John had him in mind as he was writing Revelation. But this idea that he instituted empire-wide necessary idol worship in order to buy and sell, that he's this perfect fit with the mark of the beast, just doesn't ring historically true.
And then we have the Geneva Bible, where, when is it written? Is it actually written during the reign of Christ? But then you run into a phantom time theory, and they're making predictions about the future, but are written in the past tense. So, did they get their dates wrong and it's actually 1995? Or were they actually instruments of Satan and furthering the deception?
Yeah, and so we chose these three to talk about because they're the ones that we just keep getting referenced to, but these pieces of history are being used selectively by little season eschatology defenders, and when you look at the whole story, it just paints a different picture.
I hope that you'll check out the handout either by downloading it or just watching the video where Monica is going to read through it. Really useful, and if you missed our first video, go check that out.